Imagine for a second that a 22-year-old kid, someone with practically zero life experience, makes a bad call at his entry-level job. And that single, isolated mistake accidentally triggers a global war.
Yeah, and we are not speaking metaphorically here either. We are talking about a literal chain reaction that pulls 8 major global powers into a conflict spanning 4 continents.
Right? 8 empires at each other's throats. Over 1 million casualties. And the kid who started it all, his name was George Washington.
Which is wild to think about.
It is because, when you look at a $1 bill or you see those marble statues, there's this expectation of flawless, predestined greatness. You just picture a man born with silver hair and this wooden stoicism from day one.
Right, like he was just born ready to lead.
Exactly.
Mm.
But today's deep dive is really about stripping away that mythology. We're going to look at the flesh and blood man, and we're drawing heavily on the historical context and all the buzz surrounding the new Angel Studios film, Young Washington, which actually premieres July 3rd, 2026.
Which is the day before America's 250th birthday. So the timing of that release is highly intentional.
Oh, absolutely. So for you listening right now, our mission today isn't just to give you some traditional history lesson. This is really an exploration of how catastrophic failure and just blind ambition can forge a leader.
It's a story that proves even the most iconic historical figures started out as flawed humans making terrible, almost unbelievable mistakes.
Yeah, because before you can become the father of a nation, you have to actually figure out who you are. And to understand how a 22-year-old ends up in a position to ignite a world war, we have to look at the incredibly rigid class structure of 18th century Virginia.
Right, so Washington was born into a family that had social standing on paper, but they lacked actual liquid wealth.
Which is a huge distinction back then.
Massive. He was a younger son from a second marriage, meaning he wasn't going to inherit the grand estate. He was essentially on the outside looking in.
I want to pause on that class structure for a second because it seems central to his entire psychology. He's operating in a system where English-born citizens are automatically deemed superior to colonists.
Yes.
So he desperately wants to belong to this upper-crust aristocracy.
Yeah.
But the deck is completely stacked against him.
And he is incredibly resentful of that ceiling. Add to that a very powerful emotional driver, which is unrequited love. He fell intensely for Sally Fairfax.
Right, played by Mia Rogers in the new film.
Exactly. And Sally is brilliant, she's well-connected, and she's married to the son of the most powerful man in Virginia. Washington is acutely aware that he is not deemed worthy of someone of her stature.
So he's driven by this intense need for status and driven by love. And according to the sources, Washington makes this incredibly audacious move.
He really does.
He sneaks into this exclusive party hosted by Lord Fairfax, who's played by Kelsey Grammer, by the way. And he just talks to the right people and walks out with a job surveying Fairfax's lands in the unexplored Ohio country.
It's amazing.
But I have a hard time buying this, honestly. In a highly stratified 18th century aristocracy, you don't just crash Lord Fairfax's party and demand a massive land contract. How did he actually pull that off?
Well, it sounds impossible until you understand what serving actually was at that time. It wasn't just, drawing maps. It was grueling, dangerous manual labor deep in hostile wilderness.
So not exactly a glamorous desk job.
Not at all. The highborn aristocracy had absolutely no desire to go out into the freezing woods for months on end. Lord Fairfax needed someone ambitious enough to do the dirty work and naive enough to accept the immense physical risks.
Ah, so
Right.
Washington identified that loophole. He offered himself as the expendable labor the rich required.
Exactly.
But looking at the history, is this supreme confidence we're seeing, or is it just the dangerous, blinding arrogance of youth? Because it's basically like a modern-day fake-it-till-you-make-it scenario.
Oh, for sure.
Like sneaking into a VIP tech gala and talking your way into a lead engineering job that you have zero qualifications for.
That's a great analogy. And honestly, it leans heavily toward arrogance, fueled by immense family pressure. If we look at this through the lens of his mother, Mary Ball Washington, portrayed in the film by Mary Louise Parker, we see the psychological engine driving him.
Right. She was known to be pretty demanding.
Very demanding. She was a difficult figure who constantly reminded him of their precarious financial situation. So Washington had a desperate, almost painful need to prove himself. It was less about quiet confidence and much more about an inability to stop reaching for more than seemed possible.
His ambition was constantly eye-pacing his experience.
Exactly.
And that ambition puts him right in the middle of the most contested real estate on the planet in 1753, the Ohio River Valley. And this isn't just some minor dispute over a property line.
No, not at all. Both Britain and France are claiming this territory. And whoever controls the Ohio River Valley essentially controls the interior of North America.
Because of the rivers.
Yes, they control the waterways, which were the highways of the 18th century. And maybe more importantly, they control the fur trade.
The beaver pelts.
Right. We have to remember that in this era, beaver pelts were essentially the oil of the 18th century. They were highly prized in Europe for fashion and for waterproofing. The economic stakes were just astronomical.
And the French aren't just staking a passive claim on paper either. They are actively building forts, moving troops, and establishing a hard military presence.
Which really alarms the British.
Right, the British colonists in Virginia are watching this happen, and Governor Robert Dinwiddie, who's played by Ben Kingsley, realizes he has to respond. He needs someone to deliver a formal get-out warning to the French commanders, and Dinwiddie ends up sending our 21-year-old surveyor.
Right, so Washington is sent on a brutal winter journey through hundreds of miles of frozen frontier wilderness. He finally reaches the French, hands over the formal warning, and the French essentially treat him like a child.
Ouch.
Yeah, they politely read the letter, offer him a glass of wine, and then completely ignore the demand.
That polite dismissal has to be infuriating for a kid who is so obsessed with his own status.
Oh, it was.
So Washington reports back to Dinwiddie, and Dinwiddie realizes a piece of paper isn't going to cut it. A military response is required, and he gives Washington a military command. But the force Washington gets is wildly inadequate.
Oh, completely.
They are too green, completely inexperienced, and numbering only in the low hundreds. I'm really struggling to see the logic here. The sources mention the incredible gravity Ben Kingsley brings to the role of Dinwiddie-like, a man fully aware he is placing a wildly inexperienced kid in an impossible position. But why do it? Why not send actual highly trained British regulars to deal with the French army?
Well, it comes down to the mechanics of geopolitical diplomacy. Dinwiddie's hands were tied by London. The British crown had absolutely no desire to start a formal, expensive war with France.
I see.
If Dinwiddie sends British regulars to engage the French, that is an immediate, undeniable act of war between two global superpowers.
But a colonial militia, however, offers a loophole.
Precisely. Plausible deniability. If a Virginia militia skirmishes with the French, the crown can just shrug it off as a localized border dispute rather than an imperial declaration of war.
Whoa.
Dinwiddie needed a colonial proxy, so Washington was, quite literally, a minor chess piece placed on a board he didn't even understand he was playing on.
That reframes his entire command. He thinks he is this respected military leader, but he's really just an expendable pawn in a proxy conflict.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the moment where the ambition of youth meets the unforgiving reality of frontier warfare. The skirmish at Jumonville Glen.
Right.
So it's May 28th, 1754, in what is now Pennsylvania. Washington is out in the wilderness, and his native ally, a Mingo chief known as Half King, or Tenacharison, played by Ryan Begay, warns Washington that a French patrol is camped nearby.
And Washington decides to take the initiative. He leads 40 of his men through the dark, rainy woods to surround the French position in the Glen, and as they close in, a single mysterious shot is fired. And historians actually still debate to this day who fired that first shot.
But once that musket goes off, all hell breaks loose. Within 15 minutes, 10 French soldiers are dead and 21 are captured.
Right.
But the French insist that the commander who was just killed in the crossfire, Ensign Jumonville, was actually a diplomat on a diplomatic mission, not a combat soldier.
Which changes the entire legal nature of the engagement. Because if Jumonville was an envoy, Washington didn't just win a supplies battle, he ambushed a diplomatic mission.
The situation spirals completely out of Washington's hands. The sources are very clear on what happens next, and it is incredibly brutal.
It is.
Tenacharison walks up to the wounded French commander, Jumonville. And while Washington is standing right there, Tenacharison kills Jumonville with a tomahawk.
Just right in front of him.
Before Washington can even process what is happening, the other Mingo warriors scalp 9 of the other French prisoners. And Washington is completely helpless to stop any of it. But hold on, why would an allied native leader assassinate a high-value prisoner right in front of his supposed British commander? Like, what is Tenacharison's angle here?
Well, Tenacharison had his own highly complex geopolitical agenda. His title, Half King, meant he was a representative of the powerful Iroquois Confederacy, but his actual influence in the region was slipping.
All right.
The French were building alliances with rival tribes and cutting him out. Tenacharison knew that if he could force a war between the British and the French, the British would have to commit military resources to the region, which he could then use to bolster his own power.
Oh, wow. So he's playing three-dimensional chess.
Exactly. He didn't see Washington as a commander. He saw Washington as a tool. By assassinating the French diplomat, Tennyson intentionally forced an escalation that Washington just couldn't walk back.
So at this moment in the Glen, Washington isn't a military commander at all. He's a helpless spectator to a level of violence and political maneuvering he simply doesn't comprehend.
He experienced the ultimate loss of control. I mean, he thought he was executing a textbook military maneuver. Instead, he triggered a brutal frontier dynamic that he lacked the experience, the relationships, and the authority to manage.
And the immediate consequence of Jumonville Glen is massive retaliation.
Yeah.
Because Jumonville had a brother, Louis Coulon de Villiers.
Right.
And when he hears his brother has been assassinated, he doesn't write a sternly worded letter. He assembles 600 soldiers and marches directly on Washington.
Which leads to a disaster.
Yeah. So we jump forward a few weeks to July 3rd, 1754. Washington has built a defensive structure he calls Fort Necessity. And calling it a fort is being very generous.
It was a disaster of military engineering. He built it in a depression in the ground, essentially a bowl, surrounded by higher tree lines where the enemy could literally just fire down on them.
That's terrible.
But to make matters worse, it was pouring rain.
The trenches are literally flooded. His men's gunpowder is wet, rendering their muskets completely useless. They are exhausted, they're starving, and vastly outnumbered by 600 angry French and Allied native forces firing at them from the cover of the woods.
He really has no mathematical choice but to surrender.
But this is where the story pivots from a military defeat to a world-altering catastrophe. The surrender terms are written in French, and Washington does not speak or read French.
No, he doesn't.
He has to rely on his translator, a man named Jacob van Brom.
Yeah, and Van Brom was a Dutch immigrant whose grasp of both English and French was shaky at best.
Yeah.
He was certainly not equipped to translate a highly sensitive legal diplomatic document.
So Van Brom is translating this muddy, rain-soaked document by candlelight while they're all freezing in a flooded trench.
Right.
And Washington just signs it.
Right.
But there's a fatal clause buried in that document that Van Brom misinterprets, and Washington completely misses. By signing it, Washington signs a formal confession to the assassination of a French diplomatic envoy.
It is the defining tragic irony of his early life. I mean, the man who would later secure the independence of a nation started his career by losing absolutely everything because of a piece of paper he couldn't read.
It's basically the 18th century equivalent of blindly scrolling through a giant terms of service update on your iPhone and just clicking, I agree, so you can get back to your life.
That's exactly what it is.
Except this time, the update gives the French Empire legal, documented proof of a British act of war. But I want to clarify how this actually works. How does a muddy piece of paper signed in a Pennsylvania forest ignite a global war?
Well, the French weaponized that document. They didn't just file it away in a drawer somewhere. They rushed it back to Europe, published it, and distributed it across all the royal courts.
Wow.
They used Washington's own signature as propaganda to prove that the British were bloodthirsty aggressors who murdered diplomats.
So it was a PR nightmare.
Total PR nightmare. That piece of paper provided the diplomatic justification for the escalation that became the 7 Years' War. It gave the French the moral high ground to call in their allies, which forced the British to call in theirs.
And it just spirals.
Right. Suddenly, 8 European powers are fighting across Europe, India, the Americas, and West Africa. Over 1 million people died.
All tracing back to a 22-year-old kid shivering in a flooded trench, trusting the wrong translator.
It's hard to fathom.
It really is. How does a person even survive this level of catastrophic, historic failure? The psychological weight of that has to be crushing.
To understand how he survived it, you really have to look at how his mindset evolved, which is the core narrative drive of young Washington. Right after the initial skirmish at Jumonville, Glencoe, before the disaster at Fort Necessity, Washington wrote a letter to his brother. And in it, he said, "I heard bullets whistle, and believe me, there was something charming in the sound."
Charming.
Yeah.
He just kicked off a global conflict. People are being tomahawked in front of him, and he thinks the bullets sound charming. I mean, that sounds almost sociopathic.
Well, it sounds sociopathic if you don't understand the context of an arrogant youth who still thinks war is this grand romantic adventure and believes he's basically immortal. He hadn't yet felt the real consequences. But the film brilliantly contrasts this youthful ignorance with the arrival of General Edward Braddock, played by Andy Serkis. Braddock arrives a year later as the seasoned, highly experienced British commander sent to clean up Washington's mess.
Braddock is kind of the ultimate representation of the old world, right?
He is, and Braddock refuses to adapt his European military tactics to the American frontier. He insists on linear warfare, marching his men in bright red coats, standing shoulder to shoulder in perfectly straight lines.
Let's dig into that, because it always seems so foolish in hindsight. Like, why on earth would a military commander wear bright red and stand in an open line in a dense forest?
Because in Europe, it made sense. Armies used smoothbore muskets that were highly inaccurate, and they fired black powder, which created massive clouds of thick smoke.
Oh, so you couldn't see anything.
Right. After one volley, a battlefield was so covered in smoke you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. Commanders needed their men in brightly colored uniforms and tight formations just to maintain visual command and control through the smog.
That makes a lot of sense.
But Braddock tried to apply that doctrine in the dense woods of Pennsylvania against French and native forces who fought from behind trees. It was an absolute slaughter. Braddock died because he was rigid. He had all the experience in the world, but he refused to learn or adapt to his environment.
Washington, on the other hand, is the guy who starts with zero experience, fails spectacularly, but then treats that massive failure as a masterclass in what not to do.
Exactly.
He watches Braddock die due to arrogance, and he realizes he almost died of the exact same disease.
And if we look at the cultural context provided by the sources, the producers of Young Washington note a very specific statistic. Currently, only 31% of Americans believe the American dream is still real.
Only 31%.
Yeah, and they argue that a story about effortless, predestined greatness isn't really helpful right now. What the culture needs is a story of catastrophic failure, profound atonement, and meticulous rebuilding.
I find that distinction fascinating. We were so used to origin stories that show the hero pulling the sword from the stone and immediately knowing how to rule a kingdom with perfect wisdom. But a real origin story should ask, what did this person break on the way to greatness?
Yeah.
And Washington broke something enormous. I mean, he broke global peace.
He did. And his future greatness. You know, the man who holds a starving, freezing army together at Valley Forge, who masterminds the siege at Yorktown. That was largely driven by a profound psychological need to atone for the arrogance of his 22-year-old self.
So Valley Forge is basically the direct inverse of Fort Necessity.
Exactly. At Necessity, he rushed in, built a terrible fort, and lost everything. At Valley Forge, he learned patience, logistics, and the value of strategic endurance. He turned his colossal mistakes into the curriculum for his future leadership. The bullets stopped being charming and became a heavy, sobering responsibility.
It completely reframes everything you think you know about him. And for you listening, if you want to see this brutal learning curve brought to life, young Washington stars breakout talent William Franklin Miller as George, hitting theaters on July 3rd, 2026. Because before the marble statues, before the myth, and before his face was in every cash register in the world, the father of a nation was just a 22-year-old kid standing in the freezing rain, signing a piece of paper he didn't understand, and altering human history forever.
It really forces us to look at history not as a series of inevitable grand designs orchestrated by geniuses, but as a series of fragile, very human moments where things could easily have gone another way entirely.
Which leaves me with one final provocative thought for you to chew on today. If the entire geopolitical landscape of the 18th century, and by extension the entire modern world, was fundamentally altered by a bad translation at Fort Necessity, how many other foundational moments in human history hinge entirely on simple miscommunications, or bad translations, or just everyday clerical errors?
Yeah.
What historical typos are shaping the reality you are walking around in right now? Next time you see that rigid, perfect X-ray of history, remember the muddy waters underneath. Maybe double-check what you're signing.